In this video, which is the last of a series, we're going to focus on how you write your interpretation when you're looking at an ECG where the dominant pacemaker is from an artificial cardiac pacemaker. When you look at an ECG that shows that the person has an artificial cardiac pacemaker, it looks different. However, it's really not a dysrhythmia in the sense of atrial fibrillation. The format to write your interpretation of an ECG with an artificial cardiac pacemaker is the same as we've been discussing over the course. The exception is that the dominant pacemaker, when you're talking about an artificial cardiac pacemaker, takes a little more description. For example, one part of the description of an artificial cardiac pacemaker deals with where that pacing wire is located. If it is located in the ventricle, it is a ventricular artificial cardiac pacemaker. If it's located in the atria, it is an atrial artificial cardiac pacemaker. And if you have a pacing wire in both the atria and the ventricle, we call that a dual artificial pacemaker. That's only part of the title. Then you have to determine, is this pacemaker working all the time? If it is, we call that a continuous pacemaker. If the pacemaker just fires when it needs to fire, when it's programmed to fire, and the heart really produces some of its own contractions, we call that on-demand type of pacemaker. So that's just naming the pacemaker that's working in the heart if it's an artificial cardiac pacemaker. The second step, the heart rate, find it the same way. The third step, other abnormalities, is a little bit different also. What we're really looking for is the pacemaker working. If the pacemaker appears to be working, then you're done with your interpretation. You don't have to put that down in your answer. However, if the pacemaker is not working, it's usually because it fails to fire or it fails to capture. And if that's the case, either one are true, then you put that down into your interpretation. So we'll give you some examples. So on your quiz, you are given this ECG and you're asked for your interpretation. And because you studied extremely hard on your PowerPoint on artificial cardiac pacemakers, you know that this is a ventricular pacemaker because the spike is before the funny QRS complex. All these have spikes, so that means this pacemaker is a ventricular continuous artificial cardiac pacemaker. To find the heart rate, you do it the same way. You start at the peak of the artificial QRS and you go to the next peak, count the boxes, and we find that the heart rate here is 75. So the answer to this particular ECG interpretation is it's ventricular, continuous artificial cardiac pacemaker, heart rate 75. We go to the next quiz question and they give you this, ECG. You know it doesn't look normal. You also know that this is a pacemaker because you see the spike in the first beat and you see another spike in the third beat. So what you know is that this is a ventricular artificial cardiac pacemaker. This is a beat just from the heart. It's a normal, spontaneous, intrinsic beat from the heart, followed by another pacemaker beat. So the answer to this particular question is that it's a ventricular artificial cardiac pacemaker, but it's on demand. It's not beating all the time. It just has to beat when it needs to. And again, heart rate is roughly about 110, 100. And the way you find that heart rate's the same way as you found them all in previous dysrhythmias and ECGs. Here's the peak of an R wave right on a dark vertical line. You count it over to reach The next peak, it's different on a vertical line, and that's about 100 beats per minute. The third example is a little more messy than you would want, but it's basically a dual artificial cardiac pacemaker. We have the little spike for the atrial beat. We have a little spike for the ventricular beat. They all look the same. The majority of artificial cardiac pacemakers that are dual, one wire in the atria, one wire in the ventricle, they have to be synchronous. And that means, by almost definition, that all these will be continuous, so you don't have to put that in your answer. You can if you want, but it's not needed. So the answer to this particular pattern is dual artificial cardiac pacemaker. And again, finding the heart rate, you do it the same way. You just have to, basically, can use the peak here and the peak here, and it's pretty close to 60 beats per minute. The next example is your third quiz question, and you're asked to interpret this. You understand that this is a ventricular artificial cardiac pacemaker. It is a continuous, and then something happens in this area. This is what you are going to do for your third step. What are the other abnormalities in this ECG strip? And again, what we're looking for is mainly malfunctions. So, step one, what is the dominant pacemaker in this strip? It is a ventricular artificial cardiac pacemaker, continuous. Heart rate is approximately 90 beats per minute. Your third question, is there any other abnormalities? Yes, there are. There's a spike from a pacemaker, but there is no capture of a contraction. There's no waveform. So the energy produced by the pacemaker is not enough to generate a contraction. So your answer to this interpretation is ventricular pacemaker, continuous, heart rate of about 90, and it's a failure to capture. A little more detail in your description for ECGs that are produced by an artificial cardiac pacemaker. If you have any questions or need clarifications, please let me know. Thank you.